In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, a strike costs 1 action and spells cost 2 actions. Does that seem fair to you? Hey everyone, Utkarsh from Spirit Bell Games here. Today I want to try an unusual approach by diving headfirst into naive house ruling approach of converting spells to 1 actions and by refining that one step at a time to see if we can meet the system halfway through. Today I'll begin with an unusual approach. I will first dive into house ruling the system naively by turning spells into 1 actions, see what the result of that is, and try and refine the house rule one step at a time. Let's see if we can meet the system partway. Then I want to look at the lessons learned by doing this kind of house ruling. Maybe we can understand what the designers were thinking when they made spells 2 actions, whereas they made strikes, a single strike, 1 action. And then finally, we will look at the objections that people have and the frustrations that arise because most spells are still 2 actions. Along the way, I will comment on what I think is good design and where I have created my own homebrew to patch up a few things that I think are not the best design. So let's dive in. Let's make all spells cost 1 action. Why would that not work out? Well, as a GM, I can say, I set up this encounter and the player comes in and does 3 fireballs at the start of their first turn in combat and completely decimates it. I don't like that kind of Nova ability. Now, as a player, you might say, oh, well, you're just a bad GM if you can't handle 3 fireballs in a row. And to that, I might reply, keep in mind, in Pathfinder, villains, bosses, tend to go first in initiative. And if they have 3 fireballs that they're packing, especially if they're higher rank than what you as a player might have, I don't think the party's odds of survival are that great either. So I think most reasonable people will agree that this kind of Nova effect, 3 fireballs, 3 howling blasts in a row, is not healthy for the game. So for the sake of the drama, the tension, the fact that we want to build up the combat tension as the combat plays out, instead of have it be resolved just by the very first time a spellcaster gets to go, that's a good enough reason on its own. And then the second principle, the principle of symmetry, is if it seems overpowered for the bad guys to do it, it could be overpowered for the good guys as well. Okay, so there's no way to make spells just 1 action and limit it to just 1 spell a turn, or is there? And there is the flourish trait. The flourish trait says that when you use any action with the flourish trait, you cannot use any other action with the flourish trait again on the same turn. And that seems almost tailor-made for spells, for what we are trying to design right now. All right, so let's do that next step of the homebrew. Let's make all spells 1 action, but with the flourish tag. With the flourish trait, yes, it's true that when you're just looking at spells, now you can no longer do the Nova. So it resolves our principles of drama, and it's resolved for the principle of symmetry because, hey, the villain can't do it either. But then what does the caster do with their remaining 2 actions? As optimistic designers, it can be nice to think that, oh, my spellcaster is going to use those 2 actions to reposition themselves or to use spell shapes. But as a game designer, I suggest a healthy amount of pessimism, because what I would expect some players to do, and what I would do myself, is to pick up multi-class archetypes that give me powerful 2-action activities. Because Pathfinder 2nd Edition puts power proportional to how many actions are spent. There are some exceptions, but primarily, the more actions that you spend, the more actions an activity requires, the more power it has. So what I would try and do then is combine a 1-action fireball with a 2-action double slice, or a 1-action fireball. No, let's do a 1-action lightning bolt with a 2-action megavolt from an inventor, effectively trying to get 2 lightning bolts on the same round. And now, once again, we are starting to break that principle of drama because of novaing. If you can front load all your damage in just one turn, then it's harder to keep the combat dynamic, to keep the tension going. And we've also come across now this design principle that Pathfinder 2nd Edition has, which is the principle of action proportionality, which we seem to be breaking here. Okay, so we may have to refine it just a little bit further. Okay, the powerful spells like Fireball and Howling Blizzard and Lightning Bolt, sure, let's not make them 1-actions. Let's just pick something not very powerful. Let's pick some of the least powerful single target cantrips like Frostbite or Ignition. And let's just make them 1-action with the Flourish trait, right? We've been using the Flourish trait because we don't want 3 Frostbites on the same turn, do we? Again, think of the symmetry, the principle of symmetry. So what happens when we make just these low-powered cantrips 1-action? Well, we can still combine that with a fireball, can't we? It seems like within Pathfinder's design, the cantrips, the 2-action cantrips like Ignition and Frostbite are still too powerful with when there's the possibility of combining them with a fireball or a Howling Blizzard. And the way we can tell this for sure is by looking at Clinging Ice. Now, this is a very particular option that one particular witch gets. And this has a pseudo Flourish trait because it has the Hex trait, which means that they cannot do multiples of this on the same turn. And the game assigns this Clinging Ice cantrip the power budget, to allow it to be combined with something like a fireball. And the amount of damage that the Clinging Ice does is a lot less than what the Ignition spell does starting at level 1. In fact, comparing to the melee Ignition, I think it's less than half. So even though you might think that cantrips are underpowered for their 2-action budget, there's an argument that can be made either way, which I will address later on. It still seems like it is more powerful than expected when you allow it to be combined with something like a fireball. Okay, so we do have Clinging Ice as one thing that corresponds well with our design here, but primarily we can see that Flourish, even on weak cantrips, seems too powerful, so let's try something else. We don't want to go weaker. We've seen Clinging Ice. I don't want to go weaker than that because then we are in Guidance and Shield cantrip territory, which I can already do as 1-action, but it doesn't feel as satisfying on a whole turn. So let's look at something else. Forget about Flourish for now. Let's look at resource expenditure. How about spending focus points? All right, and now we are meeting the system partway here, because there are specific sorcerers or animists or wizards that can use focus points for doing 1-action, highly effective stuff for proportional to 1 action. So something like Hand of the Apprentice, Elemental Toss, Earth's Bile. These are good ways that casters can use their 1-action to do something effective in combat. And this time we see that there's a resource expenditure attached to it. It is curious, isn't it, that we are just not getting that unrestricted strike flexibility, that there's always a cost attached. Keep this in mind as well, because we'll come back to this point later on. Oh, but those are for specific builds, the focus spells that I talked about. And there are general options too. Can you guess? I am talking about one action versions of variable action spells. The way the game is designed, regardless of which tradition of spellcasting you pick, you either get Force Barrage or you get access to Heal, starting at level 1 itself. And you can cast either of those spells with a spell slot with just one action. So why don't the one action Heal and the one action version of Force Barrage get talked about when talking about one action spells? Well, I have an idea. And this is my subjective feeling, but I think it's shared across a wide group of spellcaster players, which is that they're so inefficient. You're using up a full spell slot, which at level 1 might just be like one of 2 spell slots you get in the whole day, and using up one action, using up a whole spell slot to do one action version of Force Barrage or one action version of Heal when you can get much more value by doing the 2 or 3 action versions feels really inefficient. And so for that reason, for me personally, these things, they don't enter the conversation much. This, I will say that here, I disagree with the game, where the game values the action flexibility so much that it severely reduces how much value you can get from one action version of these spells. And this is why I have made this homebrew for specifically a sorcerer, a class archetype, called the Spell Splitter, that specializes in getting twice the value from a one action version of multiple action spells. Because I have noticed that usually something like Heal or Blazing Bolt, getting twice the value from a one action version still does not equal to the value you'd get from a 2 action version. Links to the homebrew class archetype below. Okay, so far, what have we covered? We tried making all spells one action. That did not work out. All spells one action with Flourish. We came across issues with action proportionality and the fact that we were being incentivized to do 2 action activities other than spellcasting. We tried Flourish on just the weak cantrips, but found that the power budget was still a little bit too high. We tried resource expenditure, and here we are starting to come to terms with what the game actually has. But how about just one more step? Because Earth's Bile. I mentioned Earth's Bile, and you can see something with it that we can carry forward once again, which is that it's a sustained spell. You cast it with one action, you spend a resource, but then on future turns, you can sustain it with one action. And there are other spells, even though they cannot be cast with one action, they certainly can be sustained with one action. So now we try resource expenditure plus sustain to get future turns where you can do one action versions of a spell which has decent effect. And here again, we see how every spell tradition gets at least one good one. Either you get Spiritual Armament at 3rd level, 2nd rank spells, or you get Floating Flame at 3rd level, 2nd rank spells. Also, a lot of summoning spells do something similar, where you set it up, and then on future turns, you spend one action to get a decent amount of effect. Okay, so we can't seem to get to the point where we get unconditional, unrestricted, one effective action like strikes. Instead, the game seems to want us to do something, to have some kind of trade-off. But this journey has taught us a few things. It has taught us a few principles that we can break down here. Why do most spells cost 2 actions? Well, for one thing, we want to avoid the issue of nova damage or just nova effects. The issue that combat might get resolved in just one turn, leading to the rest of the combat feeling like an anticlimactic slog. The second reason is for proportionality of effect. That a lot of times we have seen that spells have wide affect multiple targets. And in Pathfinder 2nd edition, this kind of stuff where either you're affecting multiple targets or you're doing damage plus some kind of effect, that these things require 2 actions anyway. And as a sub point over here with proportionality of effect, I want to also draw the attention that even though the grass always seems greener on the other side, it is very, very common for martial turns to also be some kind of 2-action combinations. Very commonly, it could be stride and strike for melee martials. It could be sudden charge, double slice. It can be strike from range and reload. It can be hunt prey and then strike, exploit vulnerability and then strike, overdrive and then strike. So even though it seems like, martials are getting action flexibility all the time, a lot of time they want that big effect as well. And so they also go for this 2-action combinations. And for them, that usually they get greater single target effect, whereas for casters, they get greater multi-target effects. The third point, and this is something that we haven't seen as clearly, but casters do have the option to fall back on strikes, right? I have to say, this is not my favorite point, but I know traditionally from previous editions, it was common for magic to be reserved for big moments, where the wizard would lug a light crossbow around and shoot with the light crossbow until it came time for them to bring out a powerful spell. In Pathfinder 2nd edition, casters can still pick up other ways of doing like 1 action for damage from range. Sometimes this involves diving into some feats to pick up a short bow, but it's possible. It's not my favorite thing because it does seem like you are no longer now living the fantasy of the caster. You want to sort of be doing more cantrips. But I will say, even if it's not my favorite thing, it doesn't mean I haven't done that as a caster to be more effective. I made a sorcerer that cast all of his spells from his crossbow. It was some amount of reflavoring involved. And on turns when he was down to just 1 action and needed to do something effective, he would just shoot an arrow from the short bow. And then we get to the 4th point. This is something we've been seeing again and again and again, is that casters just don't get that unrestricted 1 action, something like a strike that they could just do again and again. At least not all casters. Maybe if you build specifically for it, and even then you may have to spend resources for it. And this is, I want to say, the core of the issue is a disparity in the design between strikes and spells. There have been other games which have a lot more symmetric effect or just symmetric design in how casters and martials approach the game, so that it almost seems like you can reflavor one to the other without that much of a difference. Whereas Pathfinder 2nd edition draws a very clear line between spells and strikes. Now, I will say that classes can sometimes overlap between this divide, but these 2 systems themselves are quite separate. And I think that's very much on purpose to reflect the thematic differences between spells and strikes in the world itself. In something like a Marvel movie, you can see that casters and martials are achieving roughly about the same effect. This is what I would expect in a game of Fate, for example, where regardless of what you go in as, whether you're a spellcaster or a sharpshooter, whether you're Hawkeye or Thor or Doctor Strange or Spider-Man, the amount of effect you can have in the game to be somewhat symmetric in many different ways, and for your approach to be symmetric. But Pathfinder has made the design decision that no, these 2 things are different, and they should have different approaches. They should play differently. The mechanical differences should be reflecting the difference in themes. Is that something you agree with? Let me know, because I think we are here in a very subjective realm. There are players and GMs who strongly prefer very symmetric design because it's easy to then make apples to apples comparison. Whereas in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, the comparison becomes a lot more apples to oranges. Because you can't directly compare single target damage numbers, because that's not even what these two sides are designed for, approaching equally, it becomes more challenging to then say, okay, how does versatility in damage types and defense targeting compare with versatility in action flexibility or action usage? So those are some explanations for why spells cost 2 actions. But explaining it does not take away the sting of the perceived unfairness. And in fact, I do want to go into specific issues that people have, frustrations that arise in caster play, and try and address those individually. Some of them I think I can account for and try and allay those frustrations, but some of them I don't have a good response to outside of homebrew and house rule, because those are just built into this disparity that we have talked about. So one potential frustration is that it seems like casters cannot play with the action flexibility that the 3-action economy, that the 3-action turn provides. It seems like the marshals can play this Lego game of snapping together the 3 actions in whatever permutation they like, and that the casters are sort of locked out of it if they want to do anything impactful. And I would say, I've already mentioned that a lot of marshals do rely on 2-action activities, but it is undeniable that they do have more action flexibility. When push comes to shove, they can always just use 1-action strike and do 2 other things. So the decision-making space is bigger for marshals if you only consider action usage. But for casters, it is made up for by how many more options they get to slot into that 2-action slot. Already at level 1, when you consider cantrips and focus spell and spell slots, the ranked spells as well, we can see that the decision-making space is larger for casters than for marshals. Yes, they do only get to put one of those things in a 2-action slot and then have to figure out what to do with the remaining action. But when taken together, it's comparable to marshals, and it can even be a little bit greater. Not only that, but this decision-making space grows a lot faster for casters than it does for marshals. By the time you get to like a level 10 as a sorcerer, you have 45 spells and cantrips plus whatever focus spells you've picked up that you can choose to slot into these things. If a lot of these spells were just 1-action spells, then the analysis paralysis would be, well, paralyzing, for lack of a better word, because choosing between 45 options is one thing, but choosing between 45 options for every single slot in that 3-action turn, well, that number grows very quickly. I think it gets to like 8,500 or 85,000. I think 8,500 something possibilities of what to do if those spells were just 1 action. We're still talking about the decision space here, but I also think this is why there aren't that many variable action spells. And the ones that are present are low level. If we had a lot of spells like Force Barrage, like Heal, that had 1, 2, and 3 action options, then again, the permutations of what you can do just increases by so much. Imagine having 45 spells at level 10 and having to choose between like one action versions of all of those spells versus 2 actions versus 3 actions, and then filling in the remaining action if you go with like a 2 action version or 1 action version, filling in the other actions with the other spells, and then again having to think through whether you want to do the 2 action or the 3 action versions of them. I've mentioned the spell splitter archetype that I've created, and there's a reason why I've not gone into creating a whole lot of multi-action spells, because my understanding is that those 1 action versions of these variable action spells are meant to be as a handful of fallback options on those specific turns when you just need something to round out your turn with 1 action. And so I reject the opinion that casters don't get enough decision-making space and decision-making fun as marshals do just because they can't engage with all 3 of the actions. Because what they miss out on with the action flexibility, it's made up for in the options flexibility that they get. The second frustration that comes up is that low-powered cantrips do not seem proportional to the actions that they take up when compared to strikes. This is, when looked in the zoomed in, just comparing a strike, ranged strike with a 2-action cantrip, ranged 2-action cantrip, or a melee strike with a melee cantrip. This is quite a valid concern. But I do think we are too zoomed in when we are just looking at these options. I think a legitimate comparison here would require looking at all of the strengths of the marshals versus all of the strengths of the casters and pitting them against each other, which is beyond the scope of this video. I recommend the videos that Pathfinder has produced, where he talks about all of the different ways that casters and marshals have all of the different strengths that casters and marshals have that provides like a space in the game for either of those classes. For now, I'm just going to say that the ability of spells to punch above their weight class, as Pathfinder would put it, is what is counterbalanced by cantrips being less powerful than individual strikes. The third frustration, and this is the one that I do feel acutely when I'm playing a caster, is now that we've come down to it, the action inflexibility. I understand that the game doesn't want me to be too powerful. I get that. But there are certain turns when it's tactically sound for me to use my 2 actions for doing things other than spell casting. For example, 2 steps to get out of the reach of a 10-foot reach reactive striker, or I don't know, a step and reactive, or a step and ray shield, or some other combination of things that aren't highly powerful but feel in that one situation very charged. If I take 2 such actions and then I'm left with 1 spare action and I have nothing solid to do, that feels bad. As I've discussed previously, it is possible to round that out by doing specific builds, by making an elemental sorcerer or a universalist wizard, or animist with Earth's Vial. But if you haven't done any of that, and if you haven't done a setup in a previous round to set up a floating flame or a spiritual armament, then you're stuck with the highly inefficient option of doing a 1-action force barrage and a 1-action heal or 1-action blazing bolt. And for this particular reason, I have made the spell splitter class archetype very selfishly for my own caster play experience to alleviate this situation where it feels like a very inefficient use of a spell slot to do just 1 action force barrage, for example. It feels a lot better if I know that I can get twice the value out of it than just doing the 1 action for 1 whole spell slot. All right, so this has been pretty comprehensive discussion, I would say. of how spells interact with actions and how spellcasters use the actions in their turn. To summarize, why do spells cost 2 actions when strikes cost 1? Well, to prevent degenerate combinations, which cannot be easily otherwise prevented with something like a multiple attack penalty. Oh, this was a point actually I haven't yet mentioned, is that spells have effects that cannot be easily regulated numerically, like strikes can with the multiple attack penalty. Sometimes spells, all they do is create difficult terrain. Well, it would be hard to impose a general rule like the multiple attack penalty to prevent further spells cast on the same turn to reduce the amount of difficult terrain that creates, because then other spells do healing, other spells target saves. And so to prevent these like degenerate combinations, to prevent novaing in different ways, that's one reason why spells cost 2 actions instead of 1. The second is, yes, proportionality of effect. It's tied in, regardless of whether you're martial or you're a caster. Generally, a 2-action activity does more than just a single action would. But all that said, it's still rough to not have a 1-action fallback option. This can be mitigated by specific character builds, by resource expenditure, by setup spells, by 1-action spells. But at the end of the day, you have to decide if this disparity between spells and strikes, if this mechanical disparity, reflecting thematic disparity, means the system is right for you, or if you prefer something much more symmetric. If you do want to play Pathfinder 2nd Edition and you want to engage with a spell style of play, but not have to deal with the action inflexibility that casters bring, full casters, you have a few options within the game itself. You can play an animist. Like I've mentioned, the Earth Spile, for example, this costs 1 action to get going, and then it can be sustained with 1 action in further turns. You can play kineticists, which get this 1-action elemental blast, and then they can do AoE effects with 2 or 3 action activities. I have a homebrew class that's the Conduit, which follows a lot of the fighter accuracy and fighter damage for doing single target energy damage, but it does not have any area of effect abilities that kineticists and animists and casters get. Or you get to learn to love the power that multi-action spells bring, and either you complement it with a strike, or you just lean into the resource expenditure that regular spellcasters are required to make. I've said my piece. Now I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts? Do you find that generally the action cost of spells isn't a big deal for you, or do you find that it is deal-breaking for you when it comes to playing a caster in Pathfinder 2nd Edition or playing the system at all? Let me know down in the comments below. Let me know what you thought of all of the points that I've brought up and where you disagree. For now, this is me signing off, wishing you all engaging games.